Let's break it down straight from the hill to your hometown. No spin, no hype, just facts we find. AI's on the case, no truth left behind. Laws are written, deals are made. Who's got your back, who's throwing shade? We cut through the noise, decode the text, keeping it real. Congress in context, Congress in context, shining the light, breaking it down so you know what's right. Policies, votes, who's working for you? We bring the facts, the power is you.
Welcome to Congress in Context.
It's great to be here.
You know, we love to dive deep into these primary sources and really understand, like, what's happening in our government, beyond just the headlines.
Absolutely.
And today we're going to look at the Congressional Record from March 13th, 2025.
Wow.
Which sounds very futuristic.
It does.
But it's a really interesting document because it gives us, this like day-by-day, sometimes even like hour-by-hour account of what's happening in Congress.
It really gives you a sense of the pulse of what's going on.
Yeah, and you can see, which issues are front and center, what the different arguments are, what the legislative priorities are.
And how those priorities kind of shift throughout the day. Yeah.
So why don't we jump right in and, what were some of the things that stood out to you when you first looked at this record?
Well, I mean, right off the bat, the thing that always strikes me about the Congressional Record is just how much detail there is.
Yeah, it can be very dense.
It can be very dense, but it also means that there are these little nuggets of insight that you can pull out if you're really paying attention.
Yeah.
For example, this particular day started off with, the usual kind of ceremonial stuff. You had the opening prayer by the chaplain.
Right.
And then the Pledge of Allegiance.
And the chaplain's prayer is always interesting to look at, I think, because it often reflects kind of the mood or the issues that are top of mind.
Exactly.
What was the focus of this prayer?
Well, in this case, the chaplain really focused on the idea of guidance for the lawmakers, asking for wisdom and honesty.
Right.
And also a call for solutions to national problems, which I think is always a pretty safe bet for a chaplain's prayer.
Yeah, it's a pretty broad theme, but I guess it's always relevant.
Always relevant.
So after the prayer and the pledge, we see Senator Mullen being appointed acting president pro tempore.
Right, which basically means he's the person who's in charge of running the Senate when the vice president isn't there.
Right, and it's interesting because the president pro tempore is usually a more senior member of the majority party.
Exactly.
But in this case, it was Senator Mullen, who was relatively junior.
Yeah, and that could signal a couple of things. Maybe the more senior members were busy with other things, or maybe there was some strategic reason for choosing Senator Mullen.
It's hard to know from just the record itself, but it's something to note.
Exactly.
And then after that, we see that leadership time is reserved.
Right, which is basically when the leaders of both parties get a chance to lay out their agenda for the day.
And that's always a good indicator of what the key debates are going to be.
Absolutely.
And it looks like one of the biggest issues on this day was government funding.
Yeah, appropriations were definitely front and center, and it looks like there was already some tension brewing between the two parties on this.
We see the Senate Republican majority talking about all the work they've done on the fiscal year 2025 appropriations bills.
Right. They're pointing out that 11 out of 12 of these bills were already moved out of committee by the end of July the previous year.
And they're emphasizing that there was significant bipartisan support for these bills.
Which seems like they're trying to make the case that they're the responsible party when it comes to funding the government.
Yeah, it's almost like they're anticipating some pushback or blaming in advance.
Exactly.
But then we hear from the minority leader, and they have a very different take.
Yeah, they're talking about the very real possibility of government shutdown.
And they're putting the blame squarely on the House.
Specifically, they're criticizing the continuing resolution that the House has put forward.
Which essentially would just continue funding the government at current levels.
Yeah, it's a kind of stopgap measure, but it can create a lot of problems if it drags on for too long.
Right, because it prevents new programs from being funded, and it can make it really hard to adjust to changing circumstances. And the minority leader also makes some very pointed remarks about proposed cuts to Social Security.
Yeah, they actually mention Elon Musk and DOGE by name.
Which is a very interesting choice.
It is. It's very specific, and it seems like they're trying to tie these proposed cuts to these particular figures.
Yeah, it's a way of personalizing the issue and maybe even making it a little more controversial.
Exactly.
And they specifically mention cuts to phone services for Social Security beneficiaries.
And potential office closures, which
Yes.
would obviously have a huge impact on people who rely on those services.
Yeah, it's a very sensitive issue, and it clearly got a reaction because the Senate Republican leader then comes back and really pushes back against these accusations.
Yeah, they're basically saying that the Democrats are the ones to blame for the potential shutdown.
And they point to actions in the House and even past appropriations work when the Democrats held the majority.
They're also using some pretty strong language. They're accusing the Democrats of antics and saying that they need to focus on governing.
Yeah, it's clear that there's a lot of partisan tension around this issue.
Absolutely.
And then we get into the specifics of the legislation that's being debated, which is H.R. 1968.
The Full Year Continuing Appropriations and Extensions Act for 2025.
And as we mentioned, this is basically a continuing resolution that would fund the government for the whole fiscal year.
Right. And there are a lot of concerns being raised about the impact of operating under a CR for that long.
One of the biggest concerns seems to be the impact on military readiness.
Yeah, there are quotes from military leaders talking about potential delays in maintenance for ships and other crucial equipment.
And that really highlights the potential national security risks of relying on a CR for too long.
Absolutely.
There are also concerns about the impact on federal workers in essential services.
Yeah, the example that really stuck out to me was the Fish and Wildlife Service employees in Hawaii,
Who are working to prevent the introduction of the brown tree snake.
which could have a devastating impact on the ecosystem there.
And that's just one example of how a CR can have unintended consequences in all sorts of areas.
Right. It's not just about cutting spending. It's about how those cuts are implemented and who they impact.
And it looks like there are a lot of different amendments being proposed to this bill.
Yeah, we see amendments on everything from automatic continuing appropriations to short-term extensions and even protections for veteran federal employees.
Which suggests that there's a lot of horse trading going on behind the scenes.
Exactly.
So clearly government funding is a huge issue on this day, but it's not the only one.
Right. There are a number of other topics that are being debated as well.
Border security and immigration are also front and center.
Yeah, the Senate Republican majority is really emphasizing the importance of securing the border,
They talk about the passage of the Laken Riley Act.
which is aimed at detaining criminal illegal immigrants.
And they also mention a budget resolution that was passed to support President Trump's border agenda.
And they're claiming that these measures have already led to a decrease in border crossings.
So it seems like they're trying to present a narrative of action and results on this issue.
Exactly.
Another really pressing issue that comes up is the fentanyl crisis.
Yeah, this is something that's been devastating communities across the country,
And we see that the Senate is considering the HLT Fentanyl Act.
which would permanently classify fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I drugs.
And there's a lot of discussion about just how deadly this drug is.
Yeah, they share some really startling statistics about the number of deaths from fentanyl overdoses,
And they even compare a lethal dose of fentanyl to just a few grains of salt.
which really drives home just how potent this drug is.
And it looks like there's a lot of support for this bill.
Yeah, the Senate actually passes a cloture motion on the HLT Fentanyl Act that day.
Which means that they're going to vote on it soon.
Right, and cloture is a pretty significant step because it means that they're cutting off debate and moving towards a final vote.
So it seems like there's a real sense of urgency around this issue.
Absolutely.
But there are also some concerns being raised about President Trump's approach to this issue.
Yeah, there's a mention of concern that he might be diverting law enforcement resources away from combating fentanyl trafficking.
And towards mass deportation efforts.
Which raises some questions about priorities and whether those resources are being used in the most effective way.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these issues are all interconnected and sometimes there are trade-offs that have to be made.
Exactly.
Another area that the Senate Republicans are focusing on is regulatory relief.
Yeah, they're talking about rolling back a lot of the regulations that were put in place by the Biden administration.
And they're framing this as a way to boost the economy and reduce burdens on businesses.
Right. They're talking about resolutions to block a natural gas tax and to overturn a rule that they say is impacting energy development.
And they're also mentioning measures to protect financial privacy.
So it seems like they're trying to undo some of the things that the previous administration did.
Yeah, it's a pretty common pattern when there's a change in party control of the White House.
Ooh, absolutely.
But of course, these regulations were put in place for a reason.
Right. The previous administration would argue that they were necessary to protect the environment or consumers or other important interests.
So it's really a debate about the role of government and how much it should intervene in the economy.
Exactly.
And then we see that the issue of Social Security comes up again.
Yeah, the minority leader is expressing some serious concerns about pressure to cut phone services at the Social Security Administration.
And they're calling this cruel and saying that it would harm vulnerable populations.
They're also pushing back against claims of widespread fraud within Social Security.
Which is an argument that's often used to justify cuts to the program.
Right. They're saying that these claims are exaggerated and that they're being used as a pretext to undermine Social Security.
And they even suggest that there might be a plan to fire Social Security Administration workers and cut staff in half.
Which would obviously make it much harder for the agency to function effectively.
Yeah, so it seems like the minority leader is really worried about the future of Social Security.
Absolutely.
Another issue that generates some very strong reactions is diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Or DEI, as it's often called.
And the criticism of DEI is pretty intense.
Yeah, it's being described as racist, divisive, and anti-American.
There are claims that taxpayer money is being used to fund woke propaganda.
And a strong assertion that hiring should be based solely on merit, not identity.
So this is clearly a very contentious issue.
Absolutely. It reflects a fundamental disagreement about the goals and the impact of DEI efforts.
And then the discussion moves on to a number of other social issues.
Yeah, we see discussion of abortion, gender, and sports, and even some very disturbing allegations related to child exploitation.
There's strong criticism of Democratic stances on abortion, particularly later-term procedures.
And the vote against a bill protecting women and girls in sports from transgender athletes is highlighted.
With the argument that Democrats are prioritizing transgender individuals over the rights of women and girls.
So again, we see this very strong partisan divide on these social issues.
Yeah, it's clear that these are issues that people feel very passionately about.
Absolutely.
And then the focus shifts to China.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about the economic and security threats posed by China.
Particularly in the area of technology.
Right, they're talking about the introduction of the Fight China Act, which would restrict U.S. investments in sensitive Chinese technologies.
Like semiconductors and AI.
And there's also discussion of China's military-civil fusion strategy.
Which basically means that they're trying to blur the lines between their civilian and military sectors.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of concern about the potential for U.S. investments to end up supporting China's military.
Absolutely.
And then in addition to all of these major debates, we also see a whole bunch of other legislative activity.
Right, there are tributes to individuals and organizations.
Introductions of new bills and resolutions.
Discussion of things like the National Flood Insurance Program.
And even a budget adjustment notice.
So it's a really busy day in the Senate.
Yeah, and it really gives you a sense of the sheer volume of work that Congress has to deal with.
Absolutely.
But it also highlights the importance of staying informed and engaged.
Right, because these issues have a real impact on our lives.
And there are things that we can do to make our voices heard.
Absolutely.
We can contact our elected officials.
We can follow the news.
We can get involved in advocacy groups.
And we can even just talk to our friends and family about these issues.
Yeah, because the more informed we are, the better equipped we are to hold our leaders accountable.
Exactly.
So thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Congressional Record.
It's been a pleasure.
And we hope you'll stay tuned for more explorations of the inner workings of our government.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.